In the 1970s, Gwen McDonald from Sydney, Australia, became involved in research in past life memories, where Gwen was initially reluctant. Under hypnosis, Gwen gave information about a home where she lived in the 18th century and spoke about people she knew and the villages that were around the area. She also spoke of a man named James Mackenzie, who she did not like, and his son Nicholas, who she found annoying. When she was first regressed, she described picking lemon balm, which was used to make hot drinks. She also said how they dried the hairs in a special room at the back of the house, and of old-fashioned recipes, utensils and cooking methods. As Gwen was talking, she now took on a West England dialect. She lived in a small cottage with a thatched roof. She was asked what part of England she lived and what were the names of the surrounding villages. She said Alford, Blowerton, Stone Chapel, West Bradley, East Pennard. The year is 1780 and she lived in Somerset. Her father was Adam Duncan and her stepmother was called Bessie. She spoke about Bessie's grandfather, an old man by the name of Dobbs, who told her stories. When she was 2 years old, she was taken in a cart with her father. She wore a long dress with a frill around the bottom, and she sat up in front of the cart. They came to a big house with a smaller cottage at the back where they lived. It was called Rose Cottage and was covered with roses. As she grew older, people called her Rose. Gwen described her young life as Rose as one of happiness and contentment. Her stepmother Bessie was a happy lady with a peaches and cream complexion. She wore full skirts, button-up boots in black, blouse buttoned at wrists and forearms. And if she was in the kitchen, she wore an apron. If she was going to church, she would dress slightly differently. She would put on her best wear. Most women wore off-the-shoulder dresses, but she didn't. She wore buttons up to the neck. She always wore a mop cap with frills. Bessie was a friendly, peaceful person and was caring. If something went wrong, she never told my father. Bessie was very tolerant and liked to make people happy. She said her father was a kind man who was strong and hard, but always kind. He was a big man with heavy thighs. He had light brownish hair, which hung down to his collar. He had a round face and a straight nose with blue eyes. He wore a mid-brown coat that hung down to his hips, not very flared. Corded heavy broadcloth trousers, also mid-brown, with black boots that came up to just below his knees. If he was going on the cart anywhere, he wore a brown waistcoat that matched the brown of his trousers and coat. His shirts were like serge material in the blue or cream. The cream ones he wore mostly when he was going somewhere. The shirts were puffed out, with puffed out arms that came in tight at the wrist. He was a Scot with a Scots skin and a ruddy complexion. She said her life was routine. When her father was away for days or weeks at a time, she spent most of her time talking to Bessie and old Dobbs. She lacked friends of her own age, so was forced to spend time amusing herself. The morning meal consisted of porridge that had been left to soak overnight, which caused it to swell, so that when it was ready to eat, it resembled tapioca. Sometimes they had bread with cheese, honey or milk. They made their own soap and dried their clothes in the sun on a rope line between trees. It was her job to scrub the table that was made of timber and was bleached and scrubbed. There was no tablecloth, and the plates, utensils and assorted items were placed directly onto the table. Their home had a room for cooking and living. A bedroom for her father and Bessie had a loft on the roof, a small room for herself and a drying room out back. She would walk half a mile over the surrounding fields to Dobbs' place, where she would sew and mend for him and sometimes help him with other chores he needed doing. When all the chores were completed, she would go out into the fields and pick the vegetables for the table, but Bessie did most of the cooking. A number of times during the week, she would walk across fields, cross the stream at the stepping stones and make her way to the nearest village to buy provisions. She enjoyed this task, as it was a chance to see all the beautiful merchandise, the silks and satins, and the dresses which she could never afford. There were new threads and products for the home, and foodstuffs. She loved to look at the new laces which were brought over from France, and it gave her a chance to meet and talk with the people of the village that she came to know well. It enabled her to get away from the house and from the chores, which to her were humdrum and repetitious. On the way back from the village, she would play for a while by the stream, jumping across the stepping stones that crossed it, and would meander through the long green grass. She spoke of Carlotta, the gypsy girl. She was not supposed to visit Carlotta, but would talk to the gypsies who camped there. She used to sneak out at night and visit the gypsies' camp to watch them dance. The gypsies knew she was there, but as she was only a child, they never seemed to mind. There were 7 caravans, all bright and multicoloured, with flowers and motifs painted on them. The men were of stocky build, with olive skin and dark hair. The women wore bright dresses, layered in many colours, with anklets and bracelets. The nearby wood was important in her life and was a place she found tranquillity and peace. Sometimes she passed through the woods on the way to the old abbey, or to a place she called the Druid's Ring. However, there were certain parts of the wood where she did not go, because of smuggling along the Parrot River, and to avoid those parts of the woods where she could run into trouble. Her family feared she might become implicated in the smuggling if she came to know too much about it, or was seen in the area where the smugglers used to pass or hide their contraband. It seemed that everyone in the village was involved in the smuggling, with different people and various shops being used to hide or sell the illegal products. Most of the smuggled items were brought from France, such as lace and fine cloths. Penalties were harsh. If one was caught, one was not likely to be seen again. For Rose, the smuggling had a romantic air and helped to bring some excitement into her boring life. She described the countryside with its hills, its beautiful trees and its marshy ground. She could see a spire or tower in the distance from where she stood, and spoke of the peaceful atmosphere of the place and how it never failed to fill her with a feeling of serenity and tranquillity. Rose loved to visit the old Glastonbury Abbey, which was a ruin about 7 miles from where she lived. She talked of the old buildings, of the rubble that lay about and the long grass that grew around the ruins. Mr. Brown, who lives in the second house from the end, would take stones from the abbey to put on this floor. He shouldn't do that. Gwen then described the unique markings on the stone. One time Rose cut her foot, and Mr. Brown helped her and put her on the back of his cart, and he took her to his house and he bandaged her foot to help her walk for the journey home. One day, as she had grown older, they wanted Rose to marry a man she did not like, so she ran away to the abbey, and when they finally found her, it was freezing cold and she was huddled in the corner of the building. They put her in the cart and took her home. She was quickly put to bed, but as each day passed, her energy became less and it became harder to breathe, and Rose died 3 weeks later. Gwen was then asked to recall her death. I saw a lady and a man wearing long robes, and the man put out his hand, and I took it, and I went with him. I began to feel very light, with nothing to hold me down. It was like floating, but not floating. There was no pain, and I was very aware of the feelings and senses and thoughts, and you didn't have to speak. It was like being made of air and so free. I remember standing beside the bed and looking down at my body. I'd wasted away, and I felt free. I was standing there looking at myself, and I wondered why Bessie was crying. Then I realised I was dead, and life was no more, and I couldn't go back. It was over. I knew she couldn't see me, nor could she hear me. I would have liked to talk to her, but I was dead. I was taken to a place and was told to rest. But I felt myself being pulled back because Bessie was feeling so sad missing me, and it was holding me back. I came down to see her again and tried to tell her to let me go because it hurts. She was then taken to a place where everywhere was grass and there was water similar to earth. You could put your feet into the water and take them out again without having to dry them, as they didn't get wet. We walked to the Hall of Records, and that was where I met a man who was kind. He showed me all I had done, things I should have done but didn't do. The place was like a library and it was full of records. It was a very big place. It had a long corridor with gold light everywhere inside. He showed me my life, but I could see it in my mind, not on paper. All the things I'd done, things I needed to do and didn't do. The thing I needed to do was to be more conscious of other people. I was selfish. I only thought about myself and where I lived, my home, and not the poor people in the village and the poor children. I should have helped, but I didn't. Gwen spoke of Langport, where she'd lived. Were they able to trace the name Langport, which was in the county of Somerset? They then located some of the villages and towns that she had spoken of. Some of the villages she mentioned no longer existed and had to search older maps to find them. One place, which Gwen called Blowerton, was now spelled Blotton. However, when they checked the old maps, they found that in 1790 the name of the village was Blowerton. She spoke of another village called Stone Chapel, which no longer existed, but did in the year 1782. The other villages she spoke about still existed, such as East and West Pennard, Bradley, Langport, Somerton, Taunton and Crosscombe. Gwen spoke about her father and the trips he used to make down to the Blackdown Hills. Blackdown Hills are found in the lower region of Somerset, below Taunton. She also spoke about Parrot River and the Severn Sea, where she'd lived in the West Country. After following the river, they traced its course through the West Country, where Rose Duncan must have lived somewhere in that region. She also spoke often of a man called James Stuart Mackenzie and searched the records for the West Country of England. They came across a manuscript titled A History of Somersetshire, written in the 18th century and printed in 1794. The book showed the squires, gentry and nobility of Somersetshire who had lived during that period. On checking through the lists, they found the Honourable James Stuart Mackenzie, just as Gwen had told them. They then travelled to Somerset and checked the local historical libraries and confirmed that the Honourable James S. Mackenzie lived in the area at that time, along with some other people Gwen spoke of, and the names of some families they'd been involved with. Under hypnosis in Australia, Gwen talked about the Abbey and the rubble that used to cover the grounds, and the long grass that had grown up around the building, and the peaceful setting, the trees, the hills, and the haze that used to settle over the horizon. A haze they also noticed when they were there. She remembered the arches in the buildings, and the feathers that were etched out of stone on the sides of the arches and doors. The Abbey held very fond memories and was a very special place for her. It was also the place she'd recalled running to prior to her death. The place where she'd suffered from hypothermia, caught pneumonia, and later died. They gave Gwen an old unmarked map of the area where the Abbey might be, and asked her to point to its position on the map. Gwen then pointed near Wirial Hill and correctly pinpointed Glastonbury Abbey. She was definite in her knowledge without any difficulty explaining when given the map. She pointed out graves and then a track where coaches used to come around. They then took Gwen to Glastonbury Abbey that she'd pointed to on the map, where she found herself standing outside a long spiked iron railing, and inside was her beloved Abbey. She then proceeded to show them certain features on the doorway she'd previously described. Standing in this long-forgotten place sparked a lot of reflection. She sat on the very same rock where she remembered having sat 200 years before in 1782 as Rose Duncan. She also remembered her death, which was the last time she recalled having been inside the Abbey grounds. They checked Gwen's recall of the old Abbey and its surroundings from a 1790 description of the area, written in an old manuscript printed about 1794, which verified Gwen's description well. Gwen then pointed to a spot where 5 houses used to stand, but there was still the ruin of one old house nearby that dated back to her previous lifetime. They then approached the owner about houses that are now gone. Gwen asked the owner about the 4 or 5 houses, and he goes yes, there were 4 or 5 houses that used to be here, confirming Gwen's recall. Gwen had recalled the position of 5 houses from her conscious memories, though she'd never been to that part of the world before in this life. Gwen was then taken to the house in which Rose Duncan used to live, and felt she was now on home territory. She spoke about a stream nearby, that the stream would fork a short distance from where they would join it, and there were stepping stones across the stream and a waterfall near the fork. She told them of a shortcut that was the quickest way to go, a shortcut that she recalled. They left the road and walked across the fields. It wasn't too long before they reached the stream as Gwen had predicted. How did she know it was there? And it was the size that she had stated it would be, and it wound through the country in the direction she said it would. Gwen was correct in so many ways and had an inexplicable knowledge of the area. They walked until they reached the fork in the stream, and was again where Gwen said it would be. Above the fork was a waterfall she had also described. Gwen then came close to where she thought she would find her home, and then stopped and pointed in the direction of her house. In the distance, obscured by a few trees, was the front of the house. The thatch on the roof had been replaced by tiles and had changed. The part that was once her home was now a garage, and attached to the side of a larger house was an old pigsty. Before going to the back of the house, they asked Gwen to draw it, and then they went around to compare her drawing. Gwen had sketched a back window, which she called the drawing room, and a back door. When they turned the corner, they found that her drawing was accurate. Gwen suddenly broke into tears for the first time and was overwhelmed. Gwen was back at the home she recalled in Somerset after 200 years. She recalled the inside of Mr. Brown's home and how its floor was covered with bluish-coloured stones taken from the Abbey. She described the unique markings on the stone she saw Mr. Brown put on the floor. In Sydney, while under hypnosis, she was asked to draw these markings on the stone she'd recalled on the back of the card. The stone also had the impression of 3 fingers on the top left-hand corner. That was the stonemason's mark. Gwen then pointed to a building which was currently not being used to live in, but was now a chicken shed. The floor was covered in dirt and droppings. The current owner told them that most of the floor was original, but was deep in droppings, and no one knew what was under the dirt. When the floor was cleaned, they could see the stones, large and rectangular, covering the floor, the same as the stones that lay in the Abbey grounds. It seemed that the paving stones that Mr. Brown had taken from the Abbey over 200 years ago and remembered by Gwen under hypnosis in Sydney, still lying on the floor of what once had been part of his cottage. When cleaned, they were impressive shades of blue, some with white veins running through them. They then levered the stone out, and after a thorough wash, they could see the markings more clearly, and after comparing the stone to Gwen's drawings, the similarity was obvious. The markings that Gwen had drawn on paper and talked about matched the stones. The markings on the left-hand side of the stone matched her description, and the large spiral was on the right-hand side of the stone. There was enough to show that Gwen's drawings of the markings certainly matched the markings on the old blue-grey stone that she had led them to. Added to this were the 3 vertical lines on the top of the left-hand corner that Gwen had referred to as the 3 fingers. What were the odds of seeing under hypnosis in Sydney an incident recalled as happening some 200 years ago, where you went to a house, saw stones on the floor, one with markings in a country in which in this life you had never been to? You then find your way to and uncover the old house with its stones, though it's now a chicken shed, and find the exact stone with the markings on it you had drawn in Sydney, when the stones themselves had been buried under dirt for over 200 years. And the owner hadn't even realised they were there. Gwen had accumulated an impressive list of evidence, even though she'd never been to Glastonbury Abbey, not even to England. As a matter of fact, had never been outside of Australia. Gwen had found the very stone that she'd drawn in Sydney, a feat far beyond any element of chance. They were lucky that it was still there. All doubts about reincarnation had been dispelled.